Okay, we should be live now. YouTube says we have a very good connection and there's 5 people. Hello audience. I hope this is working. Let us know in the chat if you can hear everything, if it's clear enough, if the connection is good. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Ellie Arrow. I'm here today with a guest to talk about, as it says on the screen, discussing exiting the sex trade. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a German feminist, and I've been researching the subject of the sex trade for almost 8 years now. It's been quite a long time, and doing activism for around 5 years. And as many of you might know, here in Germany, the trade is legal and it's quite normalized, but we still deal with all kinds of problems. And but it's good to look to other countries to see what's happening there, what we can learn, or what we should maybe not do. So today I have a guest from Canada. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Andrea Heinz. I am 37 years old and I am exited from commercial sexual exploitation in Edmonton, Alberta, so the western part of Canada. I spent 7 years selling sex, and 4 of those years I was an owner and operator of a licensed massage parlor. I've since been exited for nearly 8 years, and in that time I've been working as an activist as well as a victim advocate, assisting people working through the criminal justice system, trying to testify against exploiters, just now a married mom of 3 young children, and recently published scholar, and trying to do just some bigger picture cultural projects. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. I just want to make sure that we're both audible to the audience. If someone could just say in the chat, yes, we can hear you, or can you speak louder or anything, then I can adjust that if necessary. Let me just check on my phone. I just want to make sure we're live because there's been so many different technical problems like the last time that it'd be a pity if we think we're live, but it's actually not working. And the audience is being shy again today. Let's see. Should be able to check on my phone that it's all working out. Live, but it's actually not working. Okay, it's working. Yes, okay. Yes, we're all to everyone. Always have to check this because the technology just spontaneously decides to fail in the worst moments. Okay, sorry for the interruption. So my first question would be, so first of all, this paper, I will link it down below. Everyone should read it. It's a really great summary of just the basic journey through prostitution for a very large group of women. Like, that's one of the things that I found you explained really succinctly. People have this image, there are these women who choose it and then other women who are trafficked. But actually there's this really big group of women who are sort of in the middle, who usually for economic reasons feel a push to go in. And you might say, well, there isn't a pimp, there isn't a gun to their head, there is pressure, but maybe there could be a different solution. So it's a little bit ambivalent. And this specific group of women, you were also in that situation. Can you say like what happened to you that you felt the pressure, and why did the sex trade seem like an okay solution at the time?
So I had a very normal childhood, which is not typically the story that we would hear of people who end up involved in sexual exploitation. So I grew up in an urban service area, a very northern community, the oil sands, Fort McMurray, Alberta. Shout out to Fort McMurray. I know there's some people listening from there. And it was a good upbringing, definitely economic stability. My parents have been married for over 40 years. There was no abuse in my childhood, but there was turning points for me as a youth that did change things. So when I was 3 years old, I was at a daycare, and again, both of my parents were working in the oil patch, so we were all latchkey kids. We were all daycare kids. And while I was at this daycare, I was physically abused by a woman who I guess just didn't like that I was a high energy child, and she couldn't manage me. I had untreated ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and so she would, do these alarming tactics to try to maintain me in a calm state or in a certain place. I think one of them I was told later was that she would give me portions of food that were larger than that of other children just so that I would have to remain seated, and I couldn't get up from the table until I was done eating to go play. So, as a child, you're overeating and possibly vomiting or having struggles with that. And so there was things like that. But there was also a boy who was there at the daycare, and I want to say he was about 6. I could be a little bit off, but I was 3. And my very, very first memory as a child is this boy. And it's him coming up to me and my sister during nap time and exposing his penis to us. And there was a couple moments where he would grab my hand and he would have me touch his penis, and he would teach me, vulgar profanity. I'd go home and, repeat it and get in trouble from my parents. And it really just something about that experience really started to bring me, I guess, aware of the sexuality that existed in society that I hadn't known about. So after that, being 3 and seeing male genitalia, underage male genitalia, I started to just be more aware of the hypersexuality within society. And again, this was in the mid 80s, so Madonna was very popular. I remember watching, MTV and seeing her, fawn, all these men fawning over her in these pointy bras, and all of her music videos were very, very sexualized. And it had this grooming effect on me that essentially told me, as a woman, your value will lie in your sexuality. If you want to have money, if you want to have admiration, respect, power, prestige, any of those types of things, you will have to channel that through your sexuality. I had a very good role model in my mother. She, was a worker from day one, was never a homemaker exclusively, but, she really did the double day. And so I think, there was that one protective factor with her, but we seem to forget a lot of the push from media and the impact that has on our culture and how it conditions people to believe that the world is a certain way. So despite having a really good home life that wasn't abusive and this good structure, there was these outside forces telling me something different. And so by the time I turned, I want to say about 9, I started dressing really provocatively. So wearing these, midriff cut-off tops, these tight pants, and, bless my parents, they probably just were trying to let me be an individual and letting me do my own thing. And so they didn't, ever control anything that they felt was self-expression. And I respect them for that. But, I look back now at some of those photos and I think, oh my gosh, what was I wearing? And unfortunately it was representative of, again, the 90s, and that look. So, that was kind of, I guess, when, hypersexualizing myself started to begin. And then by the time I had just turned 14, again, living up in that community, everybody's smoking marijuana, everybody's, drinking in bush parties. A lot of people were having sex at a young age. There was, children as young as 11 and 12 having sex that we knew about. So by the time that I had just turned 14, I lost my virginity to an older guy. And it really didn't seem like a big deal at the time because everybody was doing it. And I thought to myself, well, I'm already, smoking weed and I'm already, drinking beer and doing all this kind of stuff. What's the big deal if I have sex? And so then that kind of, continued on to just that teenage rebellion and, being more promiscuous than probably I should have been. And then, you kind of create this numbness to it where you just don't really think anything of it because, again, it's just part of the culture and that's just what people do. People have sex. You don't critically analyze how you are having sex. So once I turned 16, I started dating a guy who seemed to be okay in the beginning, but he developed quite a bad drug addiction during our relationship, which led to him being extremely verbally abusive with me and very controlling, very belittling, and got to the point where, eventually he started becoming physically abusive with me. He had choked me on multiple occasions. It was to the point that my father intervened and said to me, you are an abused woman. You need to leave this guy. Like, what do you see in him? He's got nothing to offer you. And at the moment, again, you're just not really in that level of maturity to be able to recognize what you are doing and what is happening to you. So I stuck it out with this guy for 3 years, and there were several issues with that, but eventually I was able to break away from him and tried to be single for a while. But in that relationship, there was also some financial abuse because I was, a fairly responsible teen. I had graduated high school on time. I always had a job. I always had money. I always had a credit card. So it was one of those things where somebody would say, well, hey, just, put that on your credit card. I'll pay you back. And it never happens. Or, hey, just pay for that this time and I'll pay you back. And that never happens. So my debt had started to climb. I was out of high school. I had no livable skills or education that was really going to be viable for me. And so I was working at the time as a personal fitness trainer, which, again, there's not much money in that. I was waitressing. I was detailing cars. I was working at a physiotherapy clinic. I was, just doing all these jobs because I couldn't get one solid career path that would guarantee me a livable wage as a single woman in my early 20s. So I'm working all these jobs. I end up starting to date a new guy. And I think that it's different with this guy and that it's going to turn out differently because he seemed at the time a bit more responsible. And it didn't pan out that way. He did bank fraud on a joint account that we had, drove me immensely in debt from that, as well as, paying cost of living for someone who developed a drug addiction and was, irresponsible with money and financial literacy. So that complicated my situation even further. And at this point, I had managed to buy a little condo here in Edmonton that my parents had lent me about $5,000 for the down payment for. And so whenever I bought this condo, I'm maintaining, I'm acquiring debt, but I'm still going to work sometimes most days, 16-hour days, working sometimes 3 different jobs every day. And I came home and there was a flood that had happened in my condo. A seat had gone, which is I guess a tap fixture that stops the water from just continuously flowing. And I had been out of town at the time, so the water had ran in the unit for 2 weeks while I wasn't there and stripped the finish off the tubs, just extensive water damage throughout the whole unit, black mold, so many problems. And at that point, my debt was really starting to reach the roof limit of what I could manage with, maxing out credit cards and everything else. And so I tried to get somebody just to assume my mortgage, like just take it over. I tried to sell it for anything that, someone would give me for it, but nobody was interested in buying a damaged unit. So, it just got to the point where I had every single credit card maxed out. I had very, very little gas in my car. I had no food in my fridge, and I couldn't add on any more hours of the day where I was working. I realized that I had to go to school. I had to turn it around somehow and get an education that was going to lead me to stability. And so I was at one of my 5 part-time jobs, and I opened up the back of a local newspaper here in Edmonton, and I saw an ad that said adult entertainment make $2,000 a week. And again, growing up in a northern community where there really wasn't a visible sex trade in any kind of way, I had no clue what that meant. I really was so naive that the only true exposure I had had to sex trade was pop culture. So again, the classic Pretty Woman story of how that told us, oh, this is, an okay activity. And as well of, like I talked about with Madonna and just that sexualized nature of womanhood that, led me to call this number, because really I just felt like, what am I going to do? Looking back now, I truly wish I would have just claimed bankruptcy. But at the moment, I didn't even know what that process was like, because I was 22 and just naive to everything. So I called this phone number and I said, I saw your ad in the paper and I need to make like $2,000 a day, let alone a week. So, please, like, can I come for an interview? Like, what's this job about? Can you tell me more? And the woman on the phone said, I can't tell you anything over the phone. You have to come to this address and meet me in person. So that was a little bit alarming, but I thought, okay, whatever. And so I show up at what I didn't know at the time was a brothel, a massage parlor. And I walk in and it's very dark. It's got this very humid smell to it, very cigarette smell, perfume mixture. And again, it's so dark I could barely even see anything. So the owner meets me at the door and she said, I'm going to be with you in 5 minutes. So just sit over here and I'll be right with you. If you want, you can have a walk through the studio and check it out. So I thought, okay, I'll do that. I've never been in an adult entertainment studio. Like, what do you do here? And I'm still kind of thinking it's like a strip club or, maybe a facility that hosts webcam rooms. I really didn't know. So I'm walking through doing this self-tour and I'm seeing beds and showers. And then it kind of connects for me because, again, seeing that in movies. So at that point, then the owner finds me and she said, oh, you had a chance to look around. And I said, yeah. And she must have just known, like, how green I was, because she looked at me with this really odd look and she said, you do know what we do here, right? And I said, yeah, I think so. I've seen this on movies. And I'm whispering, right? I'm like, this place, is this a rub and tug? And she laughed at me. And so immediately I'm thinking, okay, I must have offended her, or that's not what happens here. And she said, a rub and tug, hey? And I said, yeah, like where you give hand jobs for money? And again, she laughed and she said, no. She said, nobody comes for a hand job. We fuck for money here. And that really took me aback. It was like, okay. So now I'm thinking I'm in like some criminal facility, that's not what I was thinking. Like, this is a full-on brothel. And she said to me, so what you have to do is you have to go get a police record check. It'll cost you about $50. You go down to the city of Edmonton and take $200 and a piece of ID, and they're going to give you a license to work here for a year. And it really, really shocked me. Like, I think I froze and stood there just without an expression for probably what felt like 5 minutes. It was maybe only 10 seconds, but it was like time stopped for a minute. And I was just so shocked that was something that our city was doing. And of course, I'm there and I'm seeing all these women and they're walking around, scantily clad. I'm not seeing a single man. So, even as a child and before entering the sex trade, I identified as a feminist. So right from the get-go with me, there were those red flags that it was not an equal activity that is partaken in by both men and women. So I said to her, I don't know. I'm not one of those girls. I'm going to have to think about it and I'll let you know. Because in my mind, I had these preconceived notions of who the people are that sell sex. And it's like you mentioned already, it was the polarized ends. You are either a trafficking victim who has zero autonomy, no agency. You are, gun to your head type thinking that people will put on it, or you are this quote unquote happy hooker. You are a sex worker. You are liberated, empowered. But even just as the women walked past me in that place, in that very initial moment, I didn't pick up on that happy hooker vibe. I didn't see happy faces. I didn't see laughter. I didn't see empowerment from what I believed it to be. So to me, it was like, well, what is this place? Because I wanted to be like everybody else and neatly compartmentalize it into one or the other. And so whenever I said to her, I'm not one of those girls, she really boldly looked at me and said, okay, talk to you soon. Give it some time, talk to you soon, with the assumption, like, you'll be here, you'll be back, like, I will see you type thing, And, or maybe it was something like, see you in a week, or it was something that basically told me, like, you'll be here. And so I went home thinking to myself, no, that's just not me. My mother and father, they're good parents. I've had a good upbringing. I would disappoint my family. Um, I can't do that, right? I can't do that to their honor and to my own. And so you go home and very quickly you have nothing. You have no food. You have no option. Well, that becomes your only option. So when people often say, oh, women choose to go into that work or that activity, it's often not a choice. It's often a decision that we make in an arena where there is no choice. So I went home, and very, very quickly after, I think it was the next day, I was down getting the police record check and going through the process to begin working at the studio.
Okay. So what you're describing sounds like I kind of have two questions in one, like legal system at the time. Oh wait, I think I put my own audio down. Wait, gotta put it back up. Okay. What you're describing to me sounds very similar to the situation we have in Germany now, where there's mandatory registration with the city and you have to renew it, I think, every 2 years. But they put this. I don't agree with the current law we have. I don't think it's really helping, but they have this registration because they want to sit down with the woman, actually talk to her. Like a social worker talks to her for an hour. The pimp, if there is one, can't come inside with her to figure out if she needs help. So, like my question would be the legality in Canada, or in what city was it at the time? What was the reason behind it? Was it set up to support women? Did it offer anything other than not being bothered by the police? And then kind of like what were the implications for the everyday reality? So you might not have feared the police, but like what were you concerned with during the everyday so-called work hours?
So in Edmonton, where I reside, and many cities throughout Canada, but in Edmonton particularly, we have a long history of street exploitation, and we do also have grave concerns of overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples on our street exploitation scene. So I think back in the early 90s, when this licensing regime was created by the city of Edmonton, it was community driven and it was well intended. It came from a good place of trying to move women indoors to avoid, environmental issues of freezing to death, of people, harassing innocent women who are just walking to work, or young girls who are walking to school from being procured on the streets. It was really quite a bad time. There was a lot of women who were going missing and turning up murdered in rural areas just outside of our city. So I think now it's similar to, leaders where they have done unethical things, for example, slavery in colonialism, but it was well intended at the time. Now we can look at it differently and see that it's having a harmful normative effect. But at the time, it was well intended. So I do have to say that, because I am quite critical of the current licensing regime, but I do want to acknowledge that it did start from a place of care and concern from the community. So it was never a bureaucratic issue where people were, just trying to capitalize monetarily on women selling sex or anything like that. But the city basically thought, well, if we can get the women indoors, if we can register them, then we can do basically two main things. That would be to keep organized crime out of it. So again, pimps, traffickers, and also to keep children out of the sex trade. Because in the late 80s, maybe early 90s, Edmonton did a count. And I think at the time, I'd been told there was roughly about 250 children selling sex on our streets. So the city just really had concerns about that, rightly so. So with licensing, when they implemented it, they wanted to, ensure, again, organized crime and children not being trafficked or exploited. But I think the negative aspect to it was that it was paired with a fee. So in order to get licensed, you had to pay your municipality, your city, in order to operate. So that carried on for many, many years. And I think during the time I worked, so the 7 years, I had multiple licenses because they were neatly segregated. So if you wanted to work body rub inside a brothel, you have a body rub license. If you wanted to work escort, going to hotels and homes, you had to have an escort license. So it was quite expensive over time, and just the brothel license was $200 annually, and then my independent escort license to go to homes and hotels was averaging, I think at its peak was about $2,200 a year. It did get lowered eventually to $1,000 a year in the last few years that they were issuing these fees to the license. But in total, for the 7 years I worked, I paid the city over $10,000 just to be able to operate, which equated to me having to have sex with 41 men, essentially for free, just to pay my city to offer me no real harm reduction. So that is really the notion that our city has operated on from the beginning, is harm reduction. And I think, again, in the beginning, it did reduce some harm. We do know that here women are more vulnerable if they are outside. You know, there's people who are driving by trying to throw hot, scalding coffee at them as they stand on street corners, or they're throwing change at them, pocket change, or they're driving by and trying to open their car doors and hit them. It's quite tiered in how people treat women who sell sex, and unfortunately those on the street are deemed less valuable as women than those who manage to operate indoors in the licensed body rub regime. So eventually we did cease the Center to End All Sexual Exploitation, a local nonprofit. In conjunction with myself, we did put enough pressure on our city here that a few years ago they did abolish the fees, because we told them this is living off the avails. This is material benefit. You are charging women to have sex, to be sexually exploited. And, you know, I had always said while I operated, the city is my biggest pimp. People would always ask me, do you have a pimp? And I'd say, yeah, the city, you know, and that was really the only person that ever did direct a lot of under thumb control on me. You know, a lot of times there are unsavory owners that can dominate the women who work underneath them. And that certainly happened with me as well, too, where, you know, madams would try to pressure me, or they would try to guilt me into staying with a customer so that they wouldn't lose the cut, right? But I like to think, you know, growing up again in a pretty hard town and, you know, being a pretty dominant woman, that I was able to keep that at arm's length a little bit, you know, like it was a good preservation technique to be able to be on the offense and not readily just do what you were asked to do by an owner. So I always did operate with quite a great deal of privilege and agency, and a lot of people didn't have that opportunity. So really the city, in my opinion, was just out of line ever charging a fee. But I think to them, it's a business like any other. They look at it as, well, if we're going to have this business license, if we're going to have people coming in doing inspections and everything else, well, then that's a cost to us as the taxpayers, as the city. So, you know, the industry should be paying that. And so unfortunately that onus fell onto the woman rather than really onto any of the owners. The body rub center licenses, so for the facility itself at the time, I think was only about $70 a year. And yet the woman who is working at them and is in typically quite dire economic, you know, positioning, she is the one that is paying nearly 3 times that amount. So, you know, as representative of anything else in the industry, we have always seen that the onus is on the woman. It's never on the buyer. It's never on anyone but the woman. And it was a long fight to get them to drop those fees. And we're thankful that they did. But, you know, now it's kind of the bigger topic of dropping the licensing regime, which in my opinion is very paternal, very reactive, very ineffective, and, you know, has that normative effect that's quite detrimental to our equality.
That's a lot of great information that I didn't know. I thought Canada had prohibition for the longest time, but is it that individual cities were operating with this licensing system? But then the biggest, and it's so similar to Germany, except that we're slowly having this conversation of maybe if the state is taking money, it should owe a little bit more in return than what it is doing now, which is like there are some places to get condoms and a hot drink, but a lot of women have said if you go to that place and say I want help getting out, they're like, just stop going to the brothel. So, but I know it was a long question. What I was kind of wondering was, so during the everyday situation at a brothel or in escorting, like what was that like? What was managing that like? What was it like interacting with the various people that you came across? How did like what I remember? I don't know where I read it that you have a karate black belt. Is that right? You said
I do, yeah.
that helped you navigate those situations. And I mean, I wish every woman had one, of course. They don't. So like, but even with that, how do you, like, as you write in your paper, for some time it's possible to sustain the being in those situations, but it wears you out with time, or it does for many women. What is that everyday process, and how does it grind you down with time?
Well, as I speak to in the InStep model, which thank you for reading it because I've been trying to plug it as much as I can, so I appreciate the positive feedback on it. But in the InStep model, I identify 4 different phases. So the first phase is the entry phase. And the model itself is on a bell curve. So again, it starts low, peaks up high, comes back down low. So the entry phase is at the beginning of this model, and it is at a low point. So again, I have never met a woman who enters into the sex trade and is rich or is even in a good position of being debt free. Every single woman that I've ever met, and I've met hundreds and hundreds of women now, I have never met one that was in a good financial position at the time of entry. Some may reach that, very few, but at the time of entry, it is just not characteristic of people. So in the entry phase, you are at this very, very low position, and you've been sacrificing, right? You've been working hard. You've been doing multiple jobs. You've been breaking your back trying to just dig yourself out of your debt. And for whatever reason, there's so many, you just are at that breaking point where you just can't continue on with that. So then there's that, glorification of the sex trade, and everybody seems to know that most people in the sex trade earn an inflated wage. So that really serves to kind of suck you in and capture your attention, if nothing else. So when you're in this entry phase 1 of the model, all you can see is up, right? So you're climbing that curve, the bell curve. So all that you're seeing now is, well, I'll have money. I will be self-employed. I will be able to set my own hours. I'll be able to work around my children's schooling demands. I'll be able to put myself back in school. I'll be able to travel. I'll be able to actually maybe take a day off. There's a lot of benefits that are really pitched with the industry to try to capture new participants into it. So as you are in this entry phase, then you may have some uncertainty. I tie it to the Prochaska and Di Clemente stages of change. So at the entry point, you may be in pre-contemplation, or you may be in contemplation. It really kind of depends on your upbringing. And so a lot of people really are in pre-contemplation. They don't see anything wrong with the sex trade because they haven't had any exposure to it yet to actually know what is awaiting them. Me personally, I found I was already in contemplation. And I really accredit that to my parents and to my upbringing of, the structure of the traditional family to a certain degree. So you start into this, you enter, and immediately you're the new girl, and you're typically young, and those 2 aspects of who you are the determining factor of the degree of money that you will often make. Like, don't get me wrong, there are women who are in their 40s and 50s that have been working for a decade that still make an inflated wage and have customers. But I believe it was Rachel Morin who had stated that when she was answering the phones at brothels, every man for the most part, would say, who's the new girl, or is there any new girl, and who's the youngest on shift. And I can attest to that. I've answered, hundreds and hundreds of calls at studios, and it was always the same thing as well, too, right? Always looking for new, always looking for young, because those are the people that the buyers can manipulate. And again, not every buyer is looking to manipulate somebody, but the ones that are know who to victimize, and that would be the young, inexperienced individual. So, the money instantly, now here in Edmonton, the going rate is $300 an hour. So as soon as you walk in, you see one customer, you've made more than some of these women are making in nearly a week. And it's cash under the table, cash in hand, right on the spot. So when you're living in relative destitution, poverty, whatever it may be, you are really needing that money today, yesterday. So that is really a self-soother for the women. And then that moves them into what I call the positive active phase, which is phase 2 on my model. And I refer to that as the climb. So that is when women are starting to really reap the rewards, the financial rewards of the sex trade without as severe of the sacrifice. So again, historically, they always sacrificed, but they didn't get the reward. But now they sacrifice still, but now they're actually being rewarded for it. So that really plays into then justification and affirmation that they made the right choice in their mind, because it's getting them where they need to be. I will say that the sex trade did get me where I needed to be. It did help me reach my goals. The downside to that was that eventually I hit my tipping point at the top of the model, and then I started the descent into what I call phase 3, the negative active phase. So the tipping point is when you just reach your limits, and you have this awareness all of a sudden that you're not ascending anymore. You're not climbing, you're not benefiting, you're not happy doing it, and now you're starting the downward slope. So that's where women are starting to slip into depression, into self-harm, into addiction, and so that's really where it starts to be quite dangerous. And often at that point, going into the negative active phase, we would build our lives up around this inflated income. So while I was in the positive active phase, the climb, I renovated my condo, I sold it, and with the money that I made from that, I had enough with my sex trade earnings to purchase a $350,000 house. I was a single woman. I got a university education. I paid off all my debts substantially. And also, in that time, I was able to build a brothel. So that was $100,000 Canadian to build that brothel. And so, again, it's just, you build up this life, and often people will say, okay, well, now you're going down into this negative phase. You're on the downward climb, or the downward descent, sorry. Why don't you just leave? And what they fail to realize is that often you've, increased your cost of living. So now I didn't have a small mortgage on my condo. I had a big mortgage on a house. Now I had an education, but what was I going to do? Just stop and then take a student loan? Was I going to sell my car and get a bus pass? And looking back, truthfully, I wish I would have done those things. But in the moment, you think to yourself, well, I've already sold sex. I've already compromised who I am, and my moral compass has veered off track. Now I'm not going to just do it for nothing, right? I'm going to stick with it and reach my goals and get to where I need to be, so that it's been, quote unquote, worth it at the end of it for the sacrifices I've made. But what people fail to realize is that the longer that you sell sex, you will have more harm incurred upon you if you are not truly an autonomous person who is there of full fruition, right? Someone who's actually making that viable choice and has real meaningful options that they could fall back on. So I really saw a lot of women just following that curve. And I was one of them, definitely. And again, my model doesn't apply for trafficked women, which I call level 1 women. Obviously, they would never be on an ascending curve in any kind of way, because they never made the decision or any type of choice to get in there on their own accord. That's somebody extorting them, forcing them, exploiting them. So they don't ever ascend. It's hell from day one. Conversely, level 3 providers, what some people would call sex workers, I don't like that term, they as well would never be on this curve, because for them, they don't really enter at a low point. They're entering because of a desire to genuinely have sex for money. So the model really speaks to what I call level 2 women, quasi-autonomous women, people that are there based on constrained choice. So yes, it still could be, I guess, referenced to be a choice, because no one put a gun to your head, no one forced you to do it. But, as another survivor had said, poverty is the pimp, and so for many of us, you're there and you're trying to make the most of it, but at the end of the day, you don't genuinely want to be there. If there was another viable option that could provide you with the same opportunities, you would have left in a heartbeat. And that's definitely the same with me as well. So seeing women go through that curve, in the moment, I didn't really recognize it because I was on that journey myself. So it was, I could see some inclination of certain things, but it really kind of didn't come together for me until, I want to say, a couple years after exiting, about 2 years, maybe 3, was when all the pieces just started to fit into place, and it all started to make a bit more sense as to, what we all go through. So, it was a hard learning curve, definitely, when you're new and when you're young. The women who are on the negative active, on the downward descent, they're not very welcoming of you because you're competition. And they don't like sitting on a couch and having clients pass them over for the new girl when they feel like they've been there doing the legwork and they've put their time in and they deserve, first crack at the money. So there was a lot of unwelcoming behavior from women. I was lucky that there was one woman actually 2 women, I should say, who were quite welcoming of me. One of them, pulled me aside and said, just make sure you never do anything without a condom. You will be asked to do it. Please don't ever self-sacrifice yourself, and please be good with your money. And of course I veered off with the money issue, but I stuck with, what she said, and that rang in my head throughout the years, and I'm quite thankful. And she's still active in the sex trade, and we're friends to this day, despite, her being on a different place, or her being in a different place than I am. But the other woman, she really took up for me as well, too. So when I started working at the studio, there was items going missing. Somebody was stealing from everybody, basically. Jackets were going missing. Everyone's buying expensive stuff. So Louis Vuitton handbags were going missing. And of course, I was the new girl, so everybody knew I was broke, and, kind of thought that they could trust one another. So they started kind of saying to me, oh, it's her. She's stealing from us. And so this girl really took out for me and was like, no, it's not her. Like, she's not doing it. And she really kind of just had my back a lot of the time when the angst and anger would come from the veteran women. So unfortunately, that woman, she was murdered, and her body was dumped in a field just outside of our city here. And so, unfortunately, that was the end of her life. But, I often think about her every single day and what her life would be like if it hadn't been stolen from her. But, it really, I was lucky to have those 2 women, because I have not heard many women say that they were welcomed with open arms in the sex trade. So that's another big part for new women, is the intimidation and the fear and the uncertainty of who they're spending a lot of time with. And, you sit around on a couch and you talk whenever you're not busy. So you really eventually end up sharing quite a bit about yourself and one another. And so a lot of these women, when they have an issue with you, they know a lot about your life already. They know about your kids, where your kids go to school. They know that you have a boyfriend that you didn't tell what you were doing to. They'll out you. They will post you on social media. They'll call your family. My mother was called Sunday morning, 9 o'clock, from a woman who was angry that one of her regular clients essentially dropped her and started staying with me instead all the time. So she called my mom, woke my mother up, and was like, do you know that your daughter is selling sex? And, here's the name of the place that she works at. Just all these horrific things, where we want to believe that there's this sisterhood and that there's this unity and this common understanding of our plight. But at the end of the day, I found more often than not, it was completely the opposite. It was women who would smile at your face and then talk shit behind your back and, tell clients that you have an STI, tell other girls that you're undercutting, that you're doing more services for less money than they are. It really was a toxic environment. So it got to the point that, I just started spending a lot of the time in the rooms rather than in the staff room. And I just sit there with my laptop and just work on my schooling, because I just knew if I'm sitting in that back room, inevitably I'm going to be talking, I'm going to be sharing, and all I'm doing is setting myself up for, more targeting by people who are really not in a healthy position in their lives right now. So I knew that education would be my key to getting out of that situation. And so that was just kind of, I guess, how I navigated it, was a lot of exclusionary tactics where I would strong arm a lot of the women in time and just spend the time in the room. And then once the door chimed and it was time to meet a customer, or once I had a scheduled appointment of somebody that had booked me, then I would put down the books, see the customer, and then, go back to the books. So I always encourage women who are selling sex now to really make education a priority. And education is not, something for everybody. So I tell them, if that's not your jam, well, then just make sure that you have at least something else going on in what we call your square life, your everyday normal life outside the sex trade. So make sure that you have another job where you can go to and it's not talking about sex, seeing sex, having sex, sex all the time. And really having that bring you back when you're ready to exit sexual exploitation.
Okay. There's so many different ways that we can go from that. So we've already been speaking for 15 minutes, and the video is called Exiting. So I do want to talk about exiting, but I definitely you just spoke about the side of the women and how to navigate it and the rivalry, and I guess the system is kind of set up to undermine solidarity. But my next question would be about the buyers, the men who came to pay. There's all these different opinions floating around in the conversation. There are people who are they're all rapists, and every paid interaction in sex trade is violence. And there's all these different opinions, or that there is such a thing as an ethical sex buyer, and he respects everything that was agreed to, and then it's ethically okay, then it's a form of consent. And I know these questions are difficult to answer, as is the question of the degree of agency and such. But what is your opinion? Why do men pay for sex? What motivates them? What do they behave like towards women? What is their image of women in their mind? And is there such a thing as an ethical sex buyer? What is your take?
Well, I think with buyers, similar to sellers, there is a continuum within them. So in the 7 years I worked, I sold sex over 4,300 times. Some of those were regulars, but, kind of characteristic of the sex trade, there is a high turnover as well. Men want to see the new girl. They want to try out different ethnicities. It's almost, like choosing, a different flavor of coffee every day, like hazelnut one day, vanilla the next kind of thing. And I do struggle, because I know that there is a very big movement of anger against sex buyers. And I will say that I understand it completely, 100%. I would never say that anybody has any reasoning why they shouldn't have some type of anger, because at the end of the day, you cannot buy sexual consent. You can buy compliance, but money and using it as a coercive tool to circumvent the obtainment of genuine sexual consent, in my opinion, is violence against women. That said, I have met sex buyers that I thought were good, nice people. And that's not a very popular thing to say, especially in the abolitionist community, because, there is rightly so a movement to hold sex buyers accountable for their bad behavior. But I am truly a believer that you have to separate the offender from their offense. I believe that sex buyers are amendable to treatment. A lot of people will argue that and say, no, they're not, they just think of themselves. But I also do find that with sex buyers, they are fed a lie, right? Just like we are when we enter the sex trade as to what is to come. sex buyers are also fed the pop culture lie that women, if they're liberated, will want to have no strings attached, non-monogamous sex. And there are women that will, of course, but that's not reflective of the majority of women. Studies have found that women prefer to be in monogamous relationships and have the same sexual partner. It is more of a safety and security issue with us, perhaps with biological sizing, of men versus women, and the history of violence against women that men have often been responsible for. But there's a lot of sex buyers that I genuinely believe would have stopped coming to buy sex had I been in the position where I could have told them the truth. And of course you can't, right? Because if I would have said to the buyer, hey, John, Joe, whatever, you're a really cool guy. You're funny. You make me laugh. We have a great time. I like chatting with you. But the second that you touch me or enter my body, I want to gouge your eyes out and puke in your face. If I truly said what I had felt in that moment, they wouldn't have come back. I genuinely believe that they wouldn't have. Of course, there's going to be exceptions to that rule, as any rule. There's going to be the men and the buyers that get off on hurting women and that, enjoy the power dynamic and being in that position of control and authority. But I don't know, maybe it was just me and the men that I saw and the fact that I worked in the city's most high-end brothels and that I did operate with some degree of agency where I could reject a customer and not take them into the back room. So I think that my experience of violence from men is not characteristic of the majority of women who sell sex. In working as an advocate after exiting the sex trade, I have spoken with many women who didn't have one good experience with a sex buyer. They would say every single time they would slap me, they would choke me, they would hurt me. And I can understand that because, you look at pornography and over 90% of it is including violence against women. It does have that element of, non-consensual BDSM, like really aggressive acts of vulgarity and degradation. But I think for me, I was able to see, the doctors, the lawyers, the police officers, the politicians, all the people that really, I think, knew that if they stepped over the line, that would be the end of them professionally. So I can't say that their good behavior was reflective of some, moral compass again that was, guiding them to be a good guy. But I think that they were able to weigh the pros and cons of their behavior and understand that it was in their favor to not offend against the woman beyond the fact that they were already doing so by buying sex. So I did have, some people that would ask me, like, why do you sell sex? Why do you want to be here? And I would always kind of say the same thing to them. Well, why do you buy sex? Why do you want to be here? And so, I don't know. I don't really always have an answer as to who the typical buyer is because I have seen such a wide range of who they are. And at the end of the day, I have to believe that people are inherently good at the core of who they are if I want to believe that someone is amenable to treatment and capable of rehabilitation. So when I speak at the Sex Trade Offender Program, our local John School, I really try to avoid any type of shaming approach or shaming techniques that some people feel are effective. And yes, there are times where you have to make the person feel their own shame. But when it is external shame that we're placing upon them, I really don't think it has the benefit to lead them to be introspective or, critically assess their behavior. So at the end of the day, I just try to reach them as men and as fathers and brothers and uncles and the role that they should have that doesn't include exploiter. And I really find that now that the money isn't the hand over my mouth, I'm able to say what I want to say. I'm able to speak that truth. And because of that, I really believe that I have changed the mindset of some of the sex buyers that have come through the Sex Trade Offender Program. The program in itself here that is run by CEASE, our Center to End All Sexual Exploitation, it has a 1% to 3% recidivism rate. So, these are typically men who are arrested either on street exploitation or sometimes through hotel stings. But, there's no guarantee that they haven't gone out again and bought sex. But as for a rearrest rate, it's an extremely, extremely low rate, so 1 to 3% again. And to me, that's a pretty good amount, like if that's really what we're seeing as people that are, supposedly high frequency buyers that have been scooped up in a sting, to only see, 1 to 3% return as an arrestee, then really that's a job well done, in my opinion. And if we really want to change what's happening, both for sellers and buyers, I really think that education is key to both of them. And so it's the same thing. I would never shame a woman who sells sex. I say to them, I've been you, right? I've been in that position, and I don't have to pay your bills, right? I'm not the one that has the rent and the power bill that you have. Yes, I have my own. We all do, but we don't know someone else's financial situation. So it's very easy to try to direct blame on people for what we're seeing happening. But to me, the blame comes from the culture. It really comes from the culture. And I do feel that sex buyers can be victimized by that culture and conditioned into believing that what they're doing is a harm-free activity when it's really not. It is a harmful activity. And I think that there is something to be said about accountability. So I do support men being arrested for buying sex with the condition that there is the opportunity for them to do an adult alternative measures program, which would entail education through a John school. So, a lot of people want to just go the cut and dry approach of just arrest them, throw them in jail, they're sex offenders, put them on a registry. But, I have worked with sex offenders in my schooling as well and outside of the sex trade. And we know that with sex offenders of all types, stress is the number one cause that will lead them to reoffend. So again, if we strong arm people, if we don't try to give them the opportunity to come back into our collective community, we're not helping them, and we're not helping the culture or, those people who are victimized as a result of that.
I'd love to ask a lot more questions about that. Unfortunately, we don't have endless time, but maybe there's some papers or something that I can link so that people can read more about it, about what works, what doesn't work with John schools, if you can recommend some. I was going to say that, I share your perspective that sex buying itself is a harmful act, but that a lot of men are not conscious of the harm. I will post a video about this, maybe in a month or two, of accidentally educating a sex buyer. I didn't know he was one, working together on a project, who then kind of did his own thinking and said he never wants to do it again. And of course, I can't verify if that's really the case, but I can see in that one example. I can also see, I've done a lot of studying of the online forums of men saying, actually, something was wrong. Actually, I feel kind of weird or hollow when I come back. Something's not right about what I'm doing. They're not completely emotionally dead. There's a door there, I think, with the ones that aren't complete sociopaths. A large group that is responsive. If just someone changes the frame, their framing of the situation, and they have to sit down and imagine, well, what if I was not me, but the woman? Would I like this? And there are threads on this where the men say, no, I could never do this myself. So I just wanted to agree with you, and I'll share more information about John's in the video description. And so my next question would be about, you described the journey that women go through. And at some point, there is no way up, except, as you also write, you can try and move into a sort of management position. So that's one thing that you did. You opened your own brothel, a parlor. But you did at the same time, you were still in the trade yourself, but you also profited from other women, and you've expressed that that's something that's tricky to deal with because you have guilt over that. Maybe sometimes it's even harder when other women went through it, then, I know myself, women who experience violence, it's hard to have compassion with yourself. You need to actively learn that, but you do have it for others. So, I don't know, what do you make of it in retrospect, that whole dynamic and situation?
Well, when society tries to frame sexual exploitation as work, it would take on a lot of the same pathways, essentially, that we would see with other valid forms of work. So you look at, an entry level position, right? Your goal is essentially to climb the corporate ladder. And it's no different in the sex trade, right? You don't want to be the bottom level, lower status woman. You want to be the woman who does have the choice to say no to a customer, does have the agency to be able to say, you know what, I saw one customer today, and even though my shift isn't done yet, I don't want to see anyone else. I'm going to leave, my shift. I'm just going to wrap it up here. When you're working under somebody else, obviously their goal is profit, like you said. So whenever you own a brothel here in Edmonton, I wouldn't say necessarily by law, but by practice, the only thing that you essentially can do is rent a room to a woman. So you're not allowed, obviously, by law to do any type of directing or controlling as to what services she offers, who she decides to stay with. There's really, even though it is where we are employees under, the brothel owner, by the definition of our provincial government, they have, very conveniently framed it where women who sell sex are contracted employees. And the reason why they do that is so that brothel owners and escort agency owners don't have to pay out any type of benefits that a normal employee would have. So, paid vacation, dental, health benefits, anything like that. So really that was a way not only to evade having to give any worker entitlement to the women, but also to evade criminal arrest. Because again, it's saying, well, as a brothel owner, all I do is rent a room. I don't know what happens in that room. Maybe they just sat and played checkers all day. I don't know. All I know is that they paid me to rent a room, and that's all I am in the business of, is renting rooms. So it's really, it's funny because everybody knows what is happening in the studios, but nobody will flat out say it in our city council, anything. Like they just won't take it to the point where they actually will admit what is happening. So that makes challenges in ensuring that workers, and again, I hate to use the euphemism of work in relation to exploitation, but it really makes it hard to give them their due rights. And so we do see a lot of women who enter into the sex trade, and myself included, that aren't aware that at the end of the year, you're not going to get a tax slip. You're not going to get, health and dental benefits. Like, I thought it was literally going to be a job like any other that I had. At the end of the year, I went up to my employer and I said, can I have my T4 slip, which is our slip that we're given that says how much income we have, accrued in the year. And she laughed at me. And so at that point, I didn't realize, I'm self-employed. I'm a contractor. And now moving forward, I have to actually pay the government of Canada 30% of my wages. So then that also brings into the equation that women need to be able to budget, and they need to be able to set aside roughly 30% of their earnings. And if they don't, now they're going to be at risk of financial audit and possibly, tax evasion, tax fraud type criminal offenses. So I think for me, even though I was a pretty dominant woman, like I said, and I was able to, for the most part, control my operating techniques, I still felt an immense amount of pressure from owners. So if a client would come in and he gave me this really creeper vibe and I said, no, sorry, I'm booked, I've got someone coming, I can't stay with you. If I let that client go, then the owner would shame me. They would say, well, why do I have you here on shift if you're not in the room making money? And I'd say, well, that guy was this, he was that, whatever it may be that was off-putting. And the owners would say, well, they're all adorable. Nobody wants to have sex with any of them, right? So, but this is a business. And if you don't want to be here making money, we're going to replace you with the next girl. So there is a lot of external pressure put on the women that even if they're told you don't have to stay with someone or you don't have to do X, Y, Z in the room, the fact is that there is the culture within the sex trade that you will accept anybody, that you will, make sure that the customer is happy when they leave, customer is always right, all those types of notions that, again, are found in everyday square jobs. So for me, I think, I never had the intent to open up a studio in order to profit off of women. For me, it was really that I just wanted to be able to work independently in my own location where I could, again, choose when I wanted to work, choose who I wanted to stay with, choose what services I chose to offer them, charge them what I wanted to offer them without, having to follow what we call the a la carte pricing, which is where all women are told you charge the exact same thing, because if not, then we're going to have, issues amongst you. So for me, it was like, okay, this is the right thing to do because I am stuck in the industry for now, because again, I didn't want to regress by losing all my assets and letting them go. But yeah, it was just at the point where I thought, that was the answer to my liberation. I wasn't at a point of being able to consider exiting. So the only thing I could see to improve my situation was to climb that corporate ladder and get into a position of power myself. Now, most studios in Edmonton range between 3 to 5 rooms in each of them. And my studio was a 2-room studio. I think that there was 1 or 2 other 2-room studios in the city, but they're not very common because, like you said, a lot of the time, studios are owned by people who are not selling sex themselves. So to them, it is about the profit. It is about how many rooms are rented and trying to get them rented for every hour so that they can turn that profit. So when I had the 2 rooms, I thought to myself, well, this way, at least then if another woman is unhappy being somewhere else, I can offer a better workplace for them where they are free of any kind of pressure from an owner to do something that they don't want to do. And at the time, I kind of had this belief of, okay, I have to have someone else in the facility in order to better ensure my safety. So again, kind of falling privy to the indoor safety myth and the belief that, if someone else is in the vicinity, somehow that woman who's 100 pounds is going to save me from being stabbed or choked in a room, which now I know differently. But at the time, it was, I was still drinking the Kool-Aid. So it seemed to be the right choice. And so I did lease an empty bay, and I was 25, and I maxed out every single credit card I had again. I worked so many double shifts to save money, and eventually ended up with $100,000 and built really what became Edmonton's most high-end brothel with that money. And so in the beginning, I had some women working for me, and they were all younger. I tried to hire women who, like myself, were in their mid-20s. I never really believed that women who are 18, 19 should be selling sex. Like, don't get me wrong, I don't think any woman should be selling sex, but 18 and 19, somewhere with the word teen at the end, just really rubs me the wrong way and always has. And so I tried to hire older women, but they just weren't really around. It was just, again, those young, economically destitute women. So I took a few on, and, again, it was a pretty low volume studio, just most of us working independently off of internet sites and securing them to the in-call facility that was my studio. So while at the studio, for a time, I really thought I was helping women. I really thought, okay, at least I'm someone that does the same job that they do, right? I'm not in this position of power or control over them by the fact that I'm not, laying on my back doing the exact same job that they do alongside them. So I really kind of felt for some reason that absolved me of power and control over them, which looking back, it didn't. But again, that was self-preservation and justification, I suppose. And I also kind of, again, thought, well, it could be worse. They could end up working for someone else. We've had male buyers who have sex with them as conditions of their employment. So, again, trying to help women, but also help myself. But I think really for me, the major, major turning point came just a few months after I had built the studio. I had a young woman. She had just turned 19, and she was working for me. And she went in, it was her first shift. And I knew that, on my first shift, the very first buyer that I had seen had forced himself on me and tried to get me to do sex acts that, I wasn't comfortable with, and was telling me, all the girls do this, they don't charge as much as you. Like, he really, really victimized me. And so when this girl came on, she was 19, and I thought, oh my gosh, I don't want her to have that same experience. So I had a regular, and looking back, it was really a poor decision on my end, but he was a 77-year-old man, but a very kind man, like you said, if anyone could be considered an ethical buyer, it would have been this man, very respectful of boundaries, never a shortchanger, never a pressurer. Like he was about as good as you could get for a sex buyer. So I said to him, I have this girl who just started. she seems kind of, vulnerable, unsure. Like, would you be able to be her first customer so that she doesn't have a horrific experience, and she can kind of get a feel for the industry and what a session entails without, victimization being coupled to it so blatantly? And he said, yeah, no problem. So I was in a session with somebody else. She goes into the room with this fellow. I finish up first, and I'm coming out, and I'm in the staff room. And as soon as I come out of the session, she had maybe only been in the room at this point 10, 15 minutes. But I come out, and she's in my staff room, and she's sitting on her bum on the floor, and she's hugging her knees, and she's rocking, and she's sobbing, full tears. And so immediately, having been victimized by buyers countless times, I go into like anger mode, thinking, what did he do? Was I wrong about this guy? Is he actually someone who was trying to manipulate her because she's new and young? What did he do? So I asked her that question. What did this guy do to you? And she said, he didn't do anything. It's nothing that he did to me. But when he touches me, it's like I'm being molested by my grandfather. And so again, 19 years old and 77 years old, in the moment I thought, probably because I had been so numbed out and so used to the feeling of being violated and being so well versed in dissociating in order to endure that, I couldn't even think of how, it could be a problem that a 19-year-old would not be able to endure sex with a 77-year-old man. But obviously that moment was a real turning point for me, where I then became just so aware of what was happening to other women. I was able to see it. I was able to, in duos with them, where two of us would service one buyer, I could see, their faces change. I could see the sadness. I could see the dissociation, the moment where they would glaze over and not mentally be there anymore. And once you start being able to see that, once the blinders have come off, you can't condition yourself to go back to, being ignorant. It's there, it's powerful, it's in your face, and then it comes to the point of asking you, what are you going to do about it now? So I really was having a hard time with that. And I could relate, because when I was 23 years old, I had sex with a 93-year-old man, and it was a horrific experience, to the point that I was home after that man, and I was showering and scrubbing my skin raw, literally taking off the top layer of my skin, because I kept on thinking that I had missed a spot of washing this man's cologne off of me. But it wasn't that. It was trauma, and it was in my brain, the smell of this man, and it was triggering me, and I was so fucked up from having this 93-year-old man who was 70 years my senior touching me, that when she said that, it took me right back to that moment and remembering, oh my God, like that's what happened with that guy. That was trauma. I just did this to this woman, to this young girl. Like, how can you sleep at night doing that and think that somehow you're offering protection, you're offering harm reduction? So that was really when my house of cards started to tumble for me, that I realized, okay, yes, I may have protected them from outside elements. Yes, I may have protected them from more exploitative owners than, what I inevitably was. But I couldn't protect them from what was happening to them internally as a person, from being sexually exploited. So at that point, I really stopped putting out any ads saying, hey, we got open spots for anyone who wants to work. I started examining how I could get out of the industry. I immediately listed my studio for sale. It didn't sell because it's a cash-based business, and it's based on commission earnings. So in order for somebody to acquire a loan to buy a $100,000 business from the bank, they have to be able to show a business plan and a return on investment. And you can't predict that with a cash-based commission business. So nobody could get a loan. And of course, nobody really, unless they're selling sex themselves, has $100,000 laying around to buy a business. So I did get some people who were looking into buying it from me, but they were all men, and they all, in my opinion, had some involvement in organized crime to some degree, gang membership, international Asian trafficking. There was a lot of concerns where I just, at the moment, thought, you know what, if me as a quote-unquote good owner was harming someone, how will I ever then be able to sleep passing this studio off to somebody else who's not even going to be, at least to the degree that I was, in regards to respecting them or trying to help them. Like I couldn't do it. So I just kept on picking away, but I eventually did have a woman that I was doing duos with. And she said to me, I know that you're not happy, running this studio. You're having issues with the girls. A lot of the girls that were coming through were heavily in addiction, victims of child sexual abuse and all these things. And so obviously they're not maintaining well with scheduling or with, their own mental health. And so either I would let them go or they would just not come back for shifts. So it got to the point that I said, I just don't even want to have women here. I don't want to have any kind of hand in their exploitation. At this point, I'm realizing that I'm exploiting myself, which was hard enough to deal with, but then to add that extra layer of causing that harm to somebody else, it was really, really my breaking point. And so this woman, this other woman that I had done many duos with and such, she approached me and said, would you like for me to buy half of your studio and you can work out of your room, I'll work out of my room, right? We'll be independent as we are, basically, and we'll just use it as our in call. Because at that point, her and I were both touring and traveling quite a bit throughout North America with clients who were going on business trips, and we were doing other type of activities. We weren't just stuck in the brothel, so it made sense to me to do that, to free myself of what I was doing to other women, but to also free myself from the onus of having to also run a business too, right? Like scheduling and all these types of other things. So she bought half of the business, and I don't know why, but as soon as she bought it, she was never around. So it was really just me every day for, a couple of years after that, just unlocking the door, letting a customer in and locking the door behind him and taking him into the room, doing the session and repeating that upwards of a dozen times a day. So that was really, really where I started to hit what I call stage 2 of the negative active phase within my in-step model. And that's really the point where you are at rock bottom. You're desperate to exit. You can't see any way out despite wanting a way out so severely. You're, for many women, slipping down into substance abuse as a coping technique. Some other women possibly self-harm. I was really at the point that I was starting to fantasize about the ways that I could kill myself because I just could not see a way out. I was still trapped in this lease. She had bought half of the studio, but it was still this other half that I was stuck in. So still being so focused on money, I kept on thinking, well, do I want to just throw away $50,000? Like, again, going back into that mindset of I don't want it to be for nothing. I don't want to have had sex with men $50,000 worth to then just throw it away on this building that I created, So it really kind of kept me stuck, and I just couldn't see how I would actually make that transition from being so deeply entrenched in selling sex to then somehow going to a square job and having this normal life and talking to people about anything other than illicit sex and, very crass and vulgar type wording of things. Like I just couldn't see how that bridge would come for me and how I'd be out. So I just kept going and going, and so many women do, and it's extremely tragic.
So my next question would be on the subject of exiting. Many women I've spoken to say that even in countries with legalization, there's essentially no support. You have to go it alone. You have to go getting off of drugs or alcohol if you have issues with that. Many women do it by themselves. And also, there's the complicated dynamic of getting out and then going back and then taking a longer break, then going back again. So exit isn't always from one day to the next. But what's important about your paper is that you suggest different points in time when someone who would want to support. I don't know if you just mean if social workers, also family members, could try and support someone. Can you say like what the journey looks like when a woman goes out by herself, and how could it be different or easier or better if she was given support at those key points in time?
I think exit supports are so crucial. And it's something that no matter the framework of the country, whether it's a legalized approach, decriminalized, equality model, whatever it is, every single one of those nations is lacking severely in exit supports. And that's particularly just because of the bottom line, right? It costs money to support people who are in tough situations and looking to bridge elsewhere. It's definitely amplified when the system is legalized or fully decriminalized on both ends, because then it is that harmful normative effect that it is a job like any other. And often a lot of those women who live in those nations of, and are experiencing poverty, they're actually told, that selling sex is a viable job, and should they refuse it, that they could not qualify for any type of social assistance. And that is so sad to hear. That is extremely sad that it's like, well, when you got nothing left to do, go sell your body. And if you refuse to do that, well, so sad, too bad. Like, to me, it just astounds me. And that's really one of my biggest fears if we were to ever, as Canadians, move to a fully decriminalized model, or heaven forbid, even worse, a legalized model. And so when we did have the equality model, which was brought into Canada in 2014, it's called the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. When that was brought in, there was a caveat within it that said that there would be a $20 million investment in support services and exit strategies for people who are experiencing exploitation that would wish to exit. And of course, $20 million is great, but you look at a country that's the size of Canada and how severe our issues of exploitation of women and girls are. And $20 million goes very, very quickly and is not a lot given to each individual agency or organization. So really the shortcoming that we've seen on our model being effective and actually moving women into healthy places and into good positions is the lack of funding that is being channeled through that. So that's really my soapbox rant for sure, is that we just need more dollars invested in this. And really, we know that if we empower women to move into the economic public realm, we are helping our nation economically. We are, reducing poverty of children and single parent families. And there's so many social benefits that come if we could empower women. And I just fail to understand why we will not pay women equal livable wages in the workforce in comparison to men, but we will pay them $300 an hour for unskilled labor that requires no formal education and essentially can be done by anybody. So it seems like there is a really strong social push to not only deny women agency and collective equality, but to really funnel them into sexual exploitation. And I think I even put a tweet out about this, saying, and it's within the paper, that the inflated wages in the sex trade are really the golden handcuffs that ensure that there is a supply of marginalized women that remain available for sexual exploitation. So to me, that really reinforces again that it has to come through a cultural change of believing that people, particularly women and girls, are not purchasable commodities to be used by men. And yeah, definitely. Once you have more supports with anything, right, with tackling addiction, with tackling homelessness, any of those types of struggles that people endure, you will see a good return. You will see improvements on how people are able to effectively bridge over into their next position in life. So I do know many women who have gone at it themselves, and unfortunately, I don't know many of them that have been able to remain removed from being exploited. Almost all of them go through what I call the revolving door, which is, they hit rock bottom. They're at that bottom of the bell curve in my model. They're saying, I can't do it for one more day. I can't have another person in me violating me just so I can pay my rent. Like, I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to slip further into my addiction. I'm going to do whatever they're doing as a coping mechanism. But when we don't support them, that's exactly what happens, is the in and out and in and out. And then that further complicates it because it deeply entrenches the woman even further and longer. And it ultimately tells the woman, you can't do it, right? You failed. You could not bridge out on your own. You're a failure. All you're good at now is staying where you are. Stick with what's working for you. You're making good money. You're self-employed. Go back to that. So it really affects the woman not only in her ability to transition out, but in her ability to maintain self-worth, confidence, and self-esteem. We do also have major issues here in Canada with bridging of services. So for a lot of the times, since addiction is ultimately developed as a method to cope with being exploited, we see a lot of women who take that initial step to enter into detox, so to again, clean themselves out. But then there is a huge systemic gap that exists between detox services and long-term rehabilitation for drug addiction. So women will get to the point they have the strength, the perseverance, they get to detox, they do the detox program. Now they're ready to actually go and address and tackle the trauma and the issues that led to addiction in the first place. And they're told, sorry, there's no bed space, check back or we'll let you know in about 2 months. Well, that's great. You've cleaned her out of the addiction, but it didn't actually change what led to the addiction, the root cause. So then, of course, she goes right back into it because she has unhealed trauma. Now she has this addiction, and often, a lot of the times, that's what is leading her to then sell sex, is to be able to afford those drugs. So it's this really, really harmful cycle that just perpetuates itself over and over again because nobody's breaking any of the chains within it. And a lot of those chains, of course, are very hard to break, and they cost a lot of money. And let's be serious, we're living in a global pandemic where every government is pinching pennies and nobody is wanting to really invest in social programming as much as they are in job creation. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that, if we're not willing to do any of this groundwork, if we're not really willing to invest off the hop, we are going to be paying substantially more for it in the long run, either socially or economically, by the failure to help particularly women move out of exploitation and to become contributing earners and taxpayers and equals within Canadian society or any society.
So I'd ask one last question and then open it up for questions from the audience. So my last one would be about your experience, or maybe also some other women that you know of taking the final steps of getting out and then trying to stabilize your life and trying to, well, with time, have the same things that other people take for granted, like a normal relationship or a family. And then also going the steps from that to becoming an activist or becoming politically involved and making the decision that I won't just, I'm not just trying to take care of myself, I want to do something for other women out there.
I think it's so important that exited women, when they're in the position to be able to do so, which I am, to speak out and to share their insights. And that's not necessarily to say to be public in their visibility with their faith and their identity, but I definitely think that we need more voices of women from all spectrums of agency who have been affected and who can, rationally look back on that experience and be able to make sense of it and try to share that insight. Because I do know that we have so many wonderful people in so many countries around the world who are doing such great activism and are raising awareness and are doing the boots on the ground work. But at the end of the day, unless you have sold sex, you will always be missing that one crucial piece to the argument, and that is been there, done that. And again, that's not to take away any of the intelligence or the insights of the people who are non-experiential, but there is a gift that does come in talking about an experience when you have endured that experience. And that's not exclusive to exploitation. That could be any experience of a negative or positive impact. So I really think that I was very lucky, in that I operated, with a large degree of privilege throughout my entire time in the industry. B, that I have a really good family and those positive support systems of people that encouraged me along the way to strive for better and to do better for myself, and would let me call and just spew my verbal diarrhea at them and cry if I needed to cry, or just vent to them. Like, one of my best friends, he's a guy, and he would come and just sit on my couch literally for hours almost every single day after I exited and just let me talk. And he'd just say, how are you? Like, are you okay today? And really, I think that is something that unfortunately so many women who sell sex are not afforded. A lot of the time they're living that secret double life and they haven't told anyone about what they're doing. So when they do get to the point of trying to exit, often they are going at it alone. And if they aren't going at it alone, sometimes they have supports from, agencies that are there and are helpful. But again, with the restrictions and limitations on those agencies, sometimes that's not all that they need. Sometimes they need a friend, right? And a lot of the times, a lot of these helping agencies have advocates and they can offer support and peer support often, but it's not the same as having friends and family. It's different, right? It's still a professional relationship. So for me, I really struggled in moving beyond in my own sense of self and self-identity and like, who am I? Because I had spent 7 years being somebody else and emulating someone else and having an alias and really repressing my true feelings, my true thoughts, who I actually was. That when it was time to try to, not dissociate and remember who I was and come back into myself, that was where I really had the struggles. But I did have, the blessing of having a good support system of people who loved me and supported me. When I tried to get a job and I left the industry, I thought to myself, well, I'm not going to have a problem. This is going to be okay because I'd been self-employed for 7 years. I built my own business at 25, ground up all on my own. I have done all these other things, schooling courses. I now had a diploma. People are going to be knocking down my door like I'm a good candidate to get hired for a job. And so I really had the belief that it would be easy for me to go back to the square world because of the things I had done in the industry to try to build up to that. But I had handed out probably about 40 resumes after exiting. And I'm an honest person. I like to think I always have been. And so I put, my numbered company on my resume. And so people would, call me for an interview and they'd say, oh, wow, your resume looks so good. And, I see right here you were self-employed and you built a business. And like, what was that in? And in being honest, I would say it was an adult massage parlor. And of course, with the stigma, I would never get a call back. So I had applied for over 40 jobs in 4 months and nobody would give me a job, even jobs that I was well overqualified for, entry-level positions. It all came down to, having that scarlet A on my forehead. And so I really started to panic. And, by God's grace, I was offered a victim advocate position with CEASE, the Center to End All Sexual Exploitation, our local nonprofit, because they were looking for an advocate to assist women and anyone really who had been exploited that was going through the criminal justice system. So I do have a diploma in correctional services, and being experiential as a peer, it really well suited my background. And I often think, thank God for them, because really they were the only ones that could really understand that journey for me and kind of where I was and why I had been where I had been and why I wanted to do something different. And they saw what I had to offer as an asset rather than seeing me as a liability. Whereas a lot of people will look at women who sell sex and say, well, she's not going to come back to this job for $30 an hour when, she's been selling sex for 7 years at $300 an hour. Why would she stick around here? She's not going to be able to manage. She's used to that partying life. And, again, those preconceived stereotypical notions of who we are as people, and that we're just these hardcore partiers that just love big, fast money and, we're not responsible, or it's just all these kind of misconceptions. So I was fortunate that after 4 months, I was able to get a full-time job. And in addition to that, I ended up marrying a longtime friend from high school. So that was a big thing as well, too, is that, it was luckily an opportunity for me to be able to go into a healthy relationship and have a healthy marriage from a man who was not a sex buyer, who was never a sex buyer, didn't save me like Richard Gere did Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman. It was a normal man who had a job and, a normal life that said to me, I understand where you came from. I understand why you did what you did. And I understand why, you're the way that you are now. So there was really, the support of my parents, the support of my friends, the support of my sister, and then the support of the man that I am now married to, my husband. And the support of a good employer that could understand who I was as an exited woman. So again, there's no more position of privilege than that, right? I really was not lacking any support system. And I accredit that to being the reason why I was able to exit on the first time and remain exited for nearly 8 years now. without any, thinking, oh, should I go back? Will I go back? Like, and so now I am very happily married. It'll be, yeah, well, 8 years basically. And now I also have 3 children. So I have a 6-year-old boy, a 4-year-old boy, and almost 2-year-old girl. But I will be honest, it was very hard to move into the square world as well as the square relationship, right? So in the square world, I found myself kind of thrust into meetings with City Hall, so city councilors and, city administrators talking about the bylaw, or speaking to police about, enforcement and what that looks like with them, with the sex trade. And even though I felt like my information was valuable and was appreciated, it was very awkward for me to go into almost this formal setting and to be professional. Because when you're selling sex, it's a very laid back, again, kind of, woohoo, we're here, we're having a good time, not here for a long time, just here for a good time. You're joking with people, you're sharing a glass of wine with them. You're really loose on scheduling. It's not as rigid as the square world demands of you as an employee. So I would find myself giving these presentations, and I would have to stop and say, oh my gosh, don't say that. That's so crass, or that is so inappropriate. But it would be something that I would say without a second thought at a brothel, right? Because there isn't that formality. So I really had to recondition myself to remember that the sex trade world is not the same as the square world. And I try to tell that to women all the time now. Don't remove yourself fully from the sex trade or from the professional world, because eventually one day, whether it's through aging out or whether it's through hitting your limit, you will one day go back to the square world. And when you do, you want to remain footed in there, at least with one little foot in that world, to be able to help step back into that. It's so easy to follow the money and to say $300 an hour is where I should be rather than $30 an hour, right? Because you're thinking about how it's going to get you ahead and how it benefits you. But you don't think that is a short-term benefit that really is not going to translate into square world success or accolades. So for me, I really fully removed myself from the square world for 7 years. I was in a brothel every single day almost for 7 years. So it was very hard to transition back to the square world. And also in relationships, it was hard to tell myself, this is not an exploitative relationship. This is not a sex buyer and a sex seller. I don't have to say this to my husband. I don't have to do this with my husband. I have to be vulnerable. I have to be authentic. And those were all traits that I, had suppressed heavily in dealing with sex buyers. So even just, the ability to be intimate sexually was challenging at some points, because you tend to slip into this routine when you're selling sex. And again, you dissociate so often that you kind of have almost a script that you go off of, right? I say this now, then I turn into this position, then I do this, and you kind of mastered how you can get the sex buyer to be finished and out the door as quick as possible to get it over with. So to then go and move into genuine love and intimacy with somebody that you actually really want to be intimate with, it's hard, because you, even though you want to have that, you don't always have the ability to have that without being conscious of working towards it. So, I want to say about the first 2 years after I left the sex trade, even though I love my husband and I enjoy, sexual relations with him, I had to consciously and continuously always be catching myself and saying, again, don't say that, don't do that, don't treat him like a buyer. And he and I actually had a conversation about this not too long ago, and I told him that, after all these years, I said, I don't know if you knew this, but this is kind of how it was for me. And he said, well, I don't know if you knew this because I never told you, but for the first 2 years for me, it was also me thinking, did she do that with a sex buyer? Is she just feeding me the line that she fed to the sex buyer? Is this authentic, or is she acting? So it affects the new partner as well. And often people don't think about those vicarious victims. They just think, okay, the woman, is having a hard time connecting. But we don't think about their spouses. And we don't think of sometimes even the men who are married to women or who are dating women that sell sex while they're actively selling sex. What does that do to them to be ultimately sharing something that is supposed to be private and intimate with somebody else, And so, I really have to always believe that we're ripples in the same pond, right? You throw a stone, you are making subsequent ripples that are affecting other people and are affecting the pond's face. So in a micro sense and think, well, I'm not hurting anyone. I choose to sell sex, or I choose to buy sex and I'm an ethical buyer. But at the end of the day, we have to remember that we are a collective being. We are a collective society, and what we do, either indirectly or indirectly, does have an impact on other people. And even being a mother, I struggle sometimes with, being present in the moment and showing affection to my children. And, I think I would have been a different mother and perhaps even a better mother had I not sold sex, because I would have been able to feel emotions that I still struggle to feel these days because of so many years of dissociation and of, repression. And, so there's so many challenges that women face in exiting. And it's so easy to say, well, if you don't like doing that job, just quit. But there's so much more to it. And it's really a complex process that takes years for women to really kind of come back to their authentic self, if ever that's even a possibility.
So it's accurate to say that the process of exiting is more than physically leaving the sex trade. Like emotionally or psychologically, the exiting process is much longer. So, I would open it up.
Definitely.
I would open it up for questions now. I'm going to go through the thread and see if someone asked questions earlier. So we've been talking for quite a long time, but there's just so much to talk about. Let's see what people had questions about. And anyone who wants to ask questions now can do so. So we have about 20 people listening. That's quite good for a small channel like mine. There's someone from Korea, all the way from Korea, listening. Let me just go through the chat. So there were a lot of conversations, but let me see if I can find a question. Or maybe while I look for that, do you want to, you're also working on a documentary, right? Do you want to say a few things about that? And also, if people want to support it, how to do that?
Thank you. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate that. So I am partnering with a local video production company, Guerrilla Motion Pictures, and it's two young men who are super wonderful. And I approached them late last year and told them that sex, I was traveling with a very well-known, wealthy doctor, and I was stopped at the U.S. border, and I was fingerprinted and photographed and documented as a prostitute in the U.S. Database, immigration database. And this happened to me there was two of us traveling with him. So we both were issued a 10-year inadmissibility ban, which ultimately says, you're a risk to national security. And so that happened, right whenever I was kind of at the tipping point. And that also was a catalyst for me descending down into the negative active stage and wanting to exit and examine my options for that. So, not that I wanted the buyer to be banned or really us to be banned, but it was also very one-sided. The man who invited us to go with him to Vegas, this doctor, he did not receive the same treatment that we received at the border. The Custom and Border officer just asked him, "Are these two women prostitutes?" And he said, "Yes," because obviously he's under oath. I don't fault him for being honest. And they said, "Okay, we just needed that, and you're free to go." And so they actually ushered him to the plane to go on to Vegas. And I'm not sure, but I think they actually even held the plane for him to go to Vegas. And then they proceeded to, like I said, document us and issue us these 10-year bans. So I believed that in 2020, after my 10 years was up, that I would be able to enter into America. But in speaking with an immigration lawyer, I was told, no, it's not 10 years since you were banned. It's 10 years since you can prove that you have been exited from the sex trade completely. So because I didn't exit until the very end of 2012, I'm actually still inadmissible until the end of 2022. So now that I'm in a position of having young children and, getting the constant pressure that every parent gets to take your children to Disneyland and having concerns about being stopped at the border and not being allowed through, I really kind of thought that this could be a really good teachable moment to educate people on the lifelong issues that we face whenever we are sexually exploited, and also to be able to challenge the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to recognize my quote-unquote rehabilitation, for a lack of better terms. So the film is almost being done in the production stage and post-production. COVID has shut it down a little bit, where I was set to go to in Washington there, and yeah, it just COVID shut it down, like I said. So we're kind of at this moment just waiting for it to open so I can go get fingerprints for the absolvement of a waiver. I know that they are likely to give me a one. It did so in 2013 when I applied for one, which was 3 years eligible initially. And very ironically, they gave me this humanitarian grounds. So I found it quite odd that they would send me to to national security in the States. Yet, as I was walking out of the airport, they hand me a piece of paper as to how I can, the next day, apply for, which would cost me about $700 Canadian. And then if I'm granted this waiver, I'd be allowed to go there for 1 year. And then after this 1 year, I have to pay another $700, and I can go for that if they approve another waiver. So I kind of thought that was odd, and they're obviously unjust. So I thought, well, you know what? I'm not just going to lay down and wait 2022 till the end of it. I'm going to use this as a moment to educate people. And so I'm asking the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, like I said, to recognize my rehabilitation, the work I've been doing now, and to not give me the 1 year waiver, but to completely absolve me of the requirement to have a U.S. travel waiver in order to enter into the States. We were all set to go with funding for this film because obviously I'm, still a student myself, 3 young children, and I don't have, $50,000 or $60,000 to make a film. But we were lined up to have some grants. And when coronavirus hit, all of the grants were withdrawn from everybody, essentially. So we've now moved into crowdsourced funding through GoFundMe. We have had some donations off of the GoFundMe. We haven't had much luck yet in a substantial amount being a project that people will support us. And if not, then there is the hope that in time some more grants will open up and we can move into post-production and get this film made. So the film is called Labeled, and it examines, my story essentially, as well as the struggle to be allowed into America. But it also talks on a broader level, more macro level, about sexual exploitation and people who look at it as a job like any other or a victimless crime. So thank you for bringing it up, because we are hoping to see some increased support for it if possible.
I hope everyone could. And the last couple of minutes, the connection kept breaking off. I could still hear everything you were saying, but someone in the audience said they can't. Do you want to quickly restart the call so that when you answer the next question, we make sure everyone can hear? And I will definitely link the link to the crowdfunding below. Let's just quickly restart the call, so hopefully the connection is fixed. So just restarting the call really quick, and then I'll ask the audience questions. The questions from the audience. Okay, is it hello? You're muted, so okay, can you say something?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Okay, I hope it's good now. There's So first, there's some greetings from Russia. There's two women from Russia listening who are saying hi. And then
Hi.
someone is asking, please remind us, why do you not call it sex work? And what do you think of the chant, sex work is real work?
I personally just have issues with calling it sex work because I don't believe that money can buy authentic sexual consent. So, as I mentioned earlier, I just genuinely believe that it leads to compliance more than consent. And I just don't believe that, intimate relations and sex can be a purchasable commodity with genuine consent. So, if I think language is really important, and I just think if we call it sex work, then we really normalize the activity and remove the concerns that are within of exploitation and constrained choice. So I do try to affirm that there are people that identify as sex workers. I do believe that there are women that, say I choose to sell sex and that do have other viable options. And I make mention of them in my paper as level 3 providers. If you were to ask me if I ever met one personally that actually was able to convince me that they were authentically what I call a level 3 provider, I would struggle, and I would say maybe one almost kind of convinced me. But I kind of think still that most of them are there on some type of constrained choice. But I have heard that quote unquote sex workers do exist. And so I do want to, not come across as someone who's an absolute, or has an absolute position that would say, no, that's wrong, they don't exist, because obviously I've never met every single person who sells sex. So in being humble, I try to acknowledge that I don't know everybody who sells sex, and there may be sex workers out there. But from everybody I have ever met selling sex, I don't feel that those people are really truly representative of the industry as a whole. So I think if we use terms like sex work, it starts to lead people into thinking that the industry as a whole is non-exploitative and is rooted in genuine choice. So again, I want to make clear, it's not that I'm saying that it isn't a reality for some people, but it's not, in my experience, something that I have seen to be a reality. So in speaking just from a position of firsthand, knowledge, I can only speak to what I've seen. And to me, there was no sex workers around.
I'm curious though, leading on from that question, if you were in the trade in the 80s, right? So, or when was it exactly? Was the rhetoric of sex work around? Were women using it? Would a woman have called herself that? Even if we now say maybe it's not an accurate description, but was it there? Were women too busy to be political, or did you meet some women who were politically active while in the trade?
I didn't. I met some women who, as they were selling sex, would say, I think that the right approach is full decriminalization or legalization. But then those same women who said on, I would see them exited a couple years later and they'd be, a completely different tune. So again, I don't know. It's hard to say, really. I think people all journey through their own phases, stages, and really all I can speak to is the people like myself that are really the quasi-autonomous. So I never try to speak for trafficked individuals because I never had that experience, and I can't speak for sex workers because I was never what I consider one myself. And again, didn't really have any exposure to either what people would call sex workers. Again, I hear women kind of saying, I believe it would be better if it was legal or things. But I don't know many women who continue to subscribe to that ideology, especially exiting.
Okay, so if audience, this will be the last chance to ask some questions. I think maybe it's best if you turn off your video. I think that's what's causing the connection issues. It's better if it's just audio right now. So I would just close with, if there are no more questions, if there's anything else that we didn't talk about today that you want to leave people with, or some key messages that aren't talked about very often in the debate on the subject, that it's important for people to know and take away with them. Yeah.
I think my key message again just goes back to what I said earlier about separating offenders from offense. So there's a lot of times where people will identify us based on what we do rather than genuinely who we are. And I can't tell you how many times I was called, a hooker or a whore or a slut, despite, not being in anything except for monogamous relationships outside of the sex trade. So it's very easy to label people, to assume that they are something inclusively, all in one package. This is what you are because this is what you do. So I really work on that myself, as well as to try to really get to the root of who people are, both buyers and sellers, and to examine the causes of what is leading them to do what they do, and to not really mix the two together beyond, a bridging aspect, essentially. So really trying to, again, separate the offender from the offense. And I think that speaks to both sides, and really what we can do to try to help people in further introspection and subsequent healing.
Okay. I can see there's some discussion going on in the comment section. Someone's talking about growing up in gritty downtown Toronto, right next to the unofficial red light district. And there's someone saying that I was also assaulted in the area and believe the statistics that violence against women and girls increases in areas where there is prostitution. I've read a lot about that in Switzerland and Germany. A lot of examples of that. Yeah. But if there aren't any more questions, then I would close it here. We're almost at 2 hours. It always turns out longer than you plan. It just does, because there's so much to discuss. And I could still ask more questions now, but I want the people who come later and catch up and watch the live stream to watch the whole thing and not be overwhelmed. But yeah, I want to say thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing, and I will put everything we talked about in the description down below so people can look it up, and so they can follow you on social media. And I hope it all works out well with the documentary and everything else you've planned. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, then I'm going to end the live stream. Bye, everyone. Thank you for listening.